we have co-organized the Health Equity Speaker Series. And we're really delighted to welcome you to this today. Allison has left us to go to UNC, and Marie O'Neill, who has a joint appointment in epidemiology and EHS, has joined now as the co-organizer for this seminar series. So I want to thank both of them for their contributions to making this available to the School of Public Health. I also want to thank a long list of people who have contributed and made this seminar series possible, including the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education, the Department of Epidemiology, CSEP, the Center for Social Epidemiology and Population Health. Did I get it? Thank you, Amanda. Yay. All who have contributed time and material resources for the seminar series. And finally, most recently, the Center for Research on Ethnicity, Culture, and Health, the doctoral student group, HEBDOC, Health Behavior and Health Education Doctoral Student Group, and FASAD, which is Public Health Students of African Descent. Again, all help to support this seminar series. So let's see what else I need to say. You guys should have in front of you some little sheets of paper that look something like this. We do love to hear feedback on the seminar series, so before you leave, if you wouldn't mind just filling out this short form and leaving it up here for me at the front of the room. If you have suggestions for future speakers or other feedback for us, we welcome that input as we continue to move forward. Okay, so quick advertisement. This is actually it was the second to last speaker in the series this year. We have a late breaking addition to the speaker series. I'm really delighted to be able to announce that Nick Freudenberg, a dear friend and longtime colleague from CUNY at Hunter College. I'm looking for my form that says the name of his talk. He's going to be here. He's going to be coming here a week from Wednesday, April 2nd.
Amy, can I just go ahead and stay through?
You can stay. You're welcome to stay along.
I love
Nick
it.
is fabulous, and he's going to be talking about a new book that he has just recently published called Legal But Lethal, and it is about the corporate production of disease in this country, and he's absolutely wonderful. I encourage those of you who are able to come to his talk. It will be at noon, 12 to 1:30 on the second. Barbara, do you know the room number?
3755.
Thank you, 3755. Okay, so we'll be hosting him, and then the final speaker in the Health Equity Speaker Series will be Chiari Kershaw. She is an alum of our Department of Epidemiology, now at Northwestern University in Chicago, and she'll be talking about her work on race-based residential segregation and health, and that one is scheduled, I believe, April 17th. So hopefully we'll see many of you at those upcoming talks, and at this point I'm going to turn it over to Danielle Jacobs. Danielle is a student in our master's degree program in health behavior and health education, is also doing a joint degree in urban planning, correct, Danielle? Yes. And has been working with a team, represented over here, raise your hands, you guys. We've been working hard on a health impact assessment of the Detroit Future Cities project. And so she's going to be introducing our speaker today.
Thank you. I am very pleased to welcome a special guest to our Health Equity Speaker Series, Dr. Alexandra Nolen. Dr. Nolen serves as the director of the Center to Eliminate Health Disparities and as the Associate Director of the Coordinating Center for Global Health at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas. She is also an assistant professor in the departments of family medicine, preventive medicine and community health, and internal medicine, and associate faculty in the Institute for the Medical Humanities. She has experience coordinating community-based research and interventions, as well as policy development on public health and health equity issues. Her work has encompassed the social determinants of health, health systems development, health information systems, advocacy strategies for advancing health equity, environmental justice, the impacts of globalization on health, and the development of training materials focused on health equity. Today, she will be sharing with us her expert opinion on using health impact assessments for both research and community coalition building. She will also talk about how the local political dynamics of a community can play a large role in the HIA process. And with that, I ask that you help me in welcoming Dr. Alexandra Nolen.
Thanks very much. I figured I better stand up at the beginning or you wouldn't know who she was talking about because I'm so short. But luckily I can see over the podium today, so I think it'll work out well. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a joy and a privilege to be here. I had some really nice discussions with students and faculty today, including Ashley and Dr. Coombs, and heard about some of the work that you guys are doing, and it's really, really exciting and interesting, and it's some of the most important work that you can do in a community is looking at the opportunities for strengthening health within an ongoing planning process that may not have any awareness of what's going on. In our own community in Galveston, Texas, which is a tiny little tropical island off the coast of Texas. Did you know Texas has an island? Okay, good. We had a bit of a quicker moving hurricane in the form of Hurricane Ike that came through in 2008, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. But a lot of the talk today is really focused on the kinds of politics that can emerge, especially in these kinds of crisis situations, whether it's a slow-moving crisis or a fast crisis or whatever. I have a quick question for you guys. How many of you think that at some point in your career you're going to be faced with your career having to deal with your research having to deal with political questions? Oh, good. You're smarter than the average bear. And how many of you are dreading that moment? Yeah, it's a big pain in the neck, right? I mean, we're public health professionals. We feel like we are championing the public good that is in everyone's interest. How does it break down? How does it become so politicized? We've seen what's been happening in our country for the last few years with this rush to the edges, rush to the fringes, and this kind of a loss of the concept of a public good. And what does that mean when you're trying to build community processes, which inherently have to take the public good into account, right? I mean, this is a situation where we're asking people to come together and make decisions together, and yet we're often confronted with this ultra-individualistic stance that doesn't want a concept of community embedded in what we're talking about. So they're kind of, in some ways, they almost become this inherent contradiction, and yet we know that when we make decisions that aren't about the public good, that everybody suffers, one way or another, to greater or lesser extents. So that's kind of the context that I've been reflecting on in our work in Galveston. And let me see how we get this slideshow going here. Right. Great. So are you guys familiar with health impact assessments? Is anybody not familiar with health impact assessments? Because we have a limited time and I want to get to the good stuff, so I want to know how much time to spend on describing health impact assessments. Anybody need a refresher? Raise your hand. A little bit of a refresher? Okay. Quick one. Basically, we know that in the United States we are not getting good value for our health dollars. We spend more on healthcare services and have worse health than pretty much any country around, right? Comparatively speaking. Part of the reason for this is we do a pretty poor job of looking at how social determinants of health affect population health. And that's a lot of what the work about health impact assessments is. It's looking at non-health sector policies and examining what the health impact of those policies decisions are. And so we see this opportunity, right? This little window of opportunity for greatly enhancing the public's health, often without even spending more money, right? If we can be a little smarter about how we plan and how we consider our policies within systems. So health impact assessment is a systematic process that determines the potential effects of a proposed policy, program, plan, or project on the health of a population, considers the distribution of those effects within the population, so you might have an equity analysis within, or it may be itself an equity-oriented health impact assessment, and then provides recommendations on monitoring and managing those effects, or recommendations to adopt or not adopt a policy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this kind of assessment is done usually by reviewing and analyzing data and considering input from stakeholders. So it's intended to be an evidence-based approach. We're not supposed to be making stuff up, right? This is really about science. This is about what we know is real in public health. So can you guys, does anybody want to describe that first picture to me, the one in the upper area? Can you see what's going on there? You've got a big roadway, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lanes of traffic, and if you look inside that little yellow circle right in the middle, you see a pedestrian about to get run over. So the irony, the beautiful irony of this picture is this is right outside the CDC campus. A little closer to my home, at the bottom, you can see port container lifts directly adjacent to a very residential neighborhood. Doesn't look very pretty, but is there really a health impact there? I mean, what might, do you guys have any theories about what might be the health impact in that particular scenario?
Incredible amount of noise pollution.
Noise?
Air pollution.
Air, it's a goods movement terminal, so you have trucks or trains going in and out taking those containers places. Traffic, right? Same problems the pedestrian had, little kids running across the streets, other places. Light pollution at night is a huge deal for these guys. So, you know, they have a problem because they have this container terminal right there. It's not going to go anywhere. Nobody's naive enough to think that it's going away. But what could have been for that community if there had been prior planning put in place? What might have been different? That's kind of what we really want to try to capitalize on. Okay, so if we look at the key values of health impact assessment, and I didn't make these up, these are coming from, you know, national gurus on health impact assessments. They are democracy, equity, sustainable development, ethical use of evidence, holistic approach to health. Are any political flags flying yet? I won't comment more on that yet. So look at some examples of HIA topics that have been engaged over the last few years. You know, it's really an exploding field. It didn't start in the United States. It started in Europe, Australia, but it's really been picked up quite nicely in the United States over the last few years. Lots of health impact assessments looking at the built environment, even living wage policies, so social policies, right? Industrial activities, educational support measures, local economic initiatives, crime prevention initiatives, almost anything you can come up with that has a health impact is beginning to be understood as legitimate territory for a health impact assessment. Whether we choose to prioritize that topic for examination is a different issue, and it really raises some interesting questions about how health impact assessments are funded, who has control of the money, whether we consider health impact assessments only legitimate when there's a donor attached, or whether they should really be institutionalized as part of any kind of research that we're doing, are really interesting and kind of critical questions that the field is trying to figure out right now and struggling with a bit. Most health impact assessments are still done under a donor model of sponsorship. I hope that that changes because it's not going to be sustainable for everything that we want to look at to have to be funded by a donor. And so for us to come up with ways to engage communities effectively so that they are able to contribute to research that is in their own interest is really important. For us to find ways to build health impact assessment approaches into the kind of work that our institutions want to fund anyway is really important. And I think that there is still a lot of exploration to be had in terms of how the systems structurally support the use of health impact assessments as we move forward. Okay, so these issues are public health issues, yes, but they are also probably political issues in a lot of people's eyes. Living wage policies, for instance. And the question becomes, can we find a way to advance the public good working together? So I want to tell you a little bit about, real quickly, about the stages of an HIA because there is a particular process that's engaged. The first step is screening, basically saying, should we do an HIA in this case? The second is scoping, which is about what are we going to look at, how do we frame the question, what kind of methods are we going to be using, how would we go about completing this work. Then there's actually the assessment part of the assessment, which is looking at the data, analyzing it, figuring out what it means in the context of health. There is communicating it through reporting, and the one that usually gets dumped off at the end and inadequately dealt with is monitoring to track the effects of the HIA and the decision on health and evaluation of one's own contribution to the process. Okay. We good, Ashley? All right. So we're going to go forward. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the town where I work. Sorry about that. Galveston, Texas. Here it looks like it's on the edge of Texas, but it is actually an island. We had a population of about 55,000 prior to Ike. I will tell you that Galveston used to be the biggest city in Texas. We have a big port, and before the Houston Ship Channel was built, we had a really big port. The population began to decline in the 50s as the port in Houston was built, but it still had a pretty lively tourist industry with some port activity and a great big medical health institution, University of Texas Medical Branch. It's really nice. It's got beaches and trees and historic neighborhoods, lots of really pretty Victorian houses. You can drive through Galveston and feel like it's a really nice place to live. But since the hurricane, you can also drive through Galveston and see an enormous amount of devastation that still hasn't recovered. Historically, there has been a lot of poverty with poor health indicators and poor social indicators. There has been huge inequalities in wealth on the island that has never been adequately dealt with. There's always been a significant amount of poor quality housing and public housing, at least public housing for the last 40 years or so. Very imbalanced tax base, so lots of kinds of social problems and tensions, right? So we had this hurricane called Hurricane Ike. This is our city. This is our island. And that red line is the track of the hurricane. And what's interesting to note about the way this hurricane worked is this bottom edge of the island, which the Gulf of Mexico is down here, right? We have a really nice seawall that protects this edge of the island. And so what happened when we had the hurricane was that this water came up that red line and it pushed all that water right up that channel so that it came up the backside of the bay and hit the north side of the island, which was historically the poor part of town. It was where all the public housing was. Those red circles are the public housing. And it's where a lot of the industrial base is. It's where the port is. It's where the railroad yards are. And it dumped a layer of silt that included arsenic and mercury and lead and all kinds of nasties, cadmium, chromium, all over the island. But perhaps more long-lasting and more devastating for families is that a lot of the families in Galveston didn't have clear titles to their homes if they were low income because they had lived in them for generations. They had lived in them for 100 years. They had never gotten a clear title, so they couldn't claim FEMA money. And so we had entire neighborhoods that were just devastated. Public housing was torn down, private housing wasn't coming back, and so we had these large swaths of land on the north side of the island that are uninhabited, somewhat uninhabitable right now, and all of our public housing families, which is about 600 families, were displaced. Many of them are back on the island, but not living necessarily in public housing. So this is what the flood looked like on the island itself. I lived right over in the corner up there. We got about 4 feet of water in my house. Dime a dozen story. About 70% of the houses and buildings on the island were destroyed or badly damaged. The island looked and felt different after the hurricane. It changed demographically. The services available changed. The resources, infrastructure, social networks, data availability, everything. We did a GIS mapping initiative afterwards, and imagine trying to collect the data for GIS mapping when the entire social fabric, infrastructure, everything has changed. So tons of stuff had to be double, triple checked. Are they still in business? Is this still going? Is that road still there? Interesting challenge. My house was rebuilt by my father, bless his heart, who came and lived in it for 2 months, sleeping on concrete floors. It was rebuilt within 3 months of the storm, but I couldn't get back on the island for 6 months because I got 2 little kids. No childcare. Childcare doesn't recover the way that the banks come back quickly and the rich neighborhoods get back online and the gas stations are running. Childcare, low priority. Social services in general, low priority. I have a theory that it's as big a problem as the infrastructure recovery itself, and yet FEMA refuses to do anything to take into account the impact of not having social services back in a location has on the ability for a place to economically recover. If we had had places to put our kids, we could have been back at work a lot faster. Lots of different kinds of problems. UTMB was closed and almost destroyed. My center was reduced to 1 person, that would be me. I wasn't the director at the time, I quickly became the director. It seemed that there emerged an opportunity, which was this idea that a post-disaster planning environment could create an opportunity for accelerating local planning to address social determinants of health and health disparities through intersectoral actions and a health in all policies approach. Oh my God, does that sound like an academic? But it sounds like an academic before she tries to do this, right? Because the piece that's missing in this hypothesis is if there is an enormous amount of political will to get it done. So, we were engaged in this health and all planning and health and all policies effort, which was looking at nutrition and lack of grocery stores on the island and all kinds of things. And we decided to develop a proposal for a health impact assessment that would look at the housing sector and the health impact of rebuilding public housing. And at that point, it was proposed that we would have 2 footprint sites that would be mixed income, and the other 350 public housing sites would be scattered sites across the city. And what we wanted to do was try to figure out where the scattered sites should be. The proposal was supported by the city council and the local housing authority when the grant was awarded. And so this key question was, where should we put the scattered sites, right? Which locations present the best options for supporting the health of public housing residents, to put it more academically. So health impact assessments are a natural vehicle for a cumulative risk approach. We wanted to use an approach that allowed us to look at a lot of different indicators, not just indicators about a housing unit itself, because that housing hadn't necessarily been built. Some of it might be new, but also to understand the environment around a particular housing unit in terms of how it would support health. And so we developed a little bit of a conceptual model. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of the data so that you can kind of get a social feel for where things were happening on the island. So this is a map of residents living in extreme poverty, which is less than 50% of the federal poverty level. Do you guys know what the federal poverty level is these days? It's about 12, 13,000 for a single person. It goes up as you add more people to the family. So less than $6,500 a year annual income, right? So those dark brown patches, just so we're all clear on this, show that more than 25% of the residents in that area make less than $6,500 a year. That's pretty significant. 15 to 25% in the tan areas, right? So still quite a bit of extreme poverty for the U.S., extreme poverty, right? Okay, so this is still low income. It's less than 175% of the federal poverty level, and you see that the footprint gets much, much bigger. We've got a lot of poor people in Galveston. And the issue of public housing affects a lot of them, but the problem of poverty in Galveston extends way beyond public housing residents. This is where the public housing sites were prior to the hurricane, and they were all torn down, except this square down in San Jacinto neighborhood is an elderly folks' residence that is still there. Okay? So this is segregation in Galveston before Hurricane Ike, and I don't know what Michigan has going on in terms of housing segregation, but in Texas right now, the only public housing that is being built in Texas is being built in neighborhoods that already have high levels of concentrated poverty and high levels of segregation. And the reason is because the way that the state has set up the application process for getting low-income housing tax credits, which is the subsidies that are given to builders to build affordable housing, is that if someone in a neighborhood for which a LIHTC is being applied writes a letter and objects, the Texas Housing Commission will nix it. It might take a couple letters if you're not a bigwig. So we have this problem where the federal intent and mandates for public housing codified in the rules to affirmatively further fair housing, in which you're not supposed to build public housing in areas of high concentration of poverty or segregation, are being systematically underlined by the state policy-making structures. Okay? I'm not going to throw too many of those kind of things at you guys, but there's a whole lot of them going on. So this is all the food outlets in Galveston. Oh man, we got food everywhere, don't we? These are our grocery stores. Sorry, the angles are kind of, just cock your head a little sideways. These are our grocery stores. And the ring around them is generally considered the walking distance to a grocery store. Remember where our high poverty areas are? And overlay this with a map of people with access to a car and where the transportation routes are, and you begin to see really, really big problems that explain an awful lot of the nutritional level, nutritional intake of Galvestonians. Not to mention we're a party island and we're all on vacation all year, right? So these are the pre-Ike access to a vehicle, percent of households with at least one vehicle. The darkest brown areas are less than 60% of households have a car. Tan is 60 to 70% of households have a car. So it's not like you can't, but it becomes a hassle, right? If you got to ask to borrow a car every time. Okay, so One of the things that we knew going into this process was that this was going to be a battle. The idea of taking on the public housing discussion was going to be a challenge because it already was a challenge. And so we knew that we could see coming that the City Council and the Housing Authority Board were expected to turn over, and they did about 4 months after we were funded to do the project. City Council includes the mayor. The mayor appoints the Housing Authority Board. Okay? So we decided that we needed a much deepened community engagement strategy, that this would serve us well, and we were probably going to need an extended timeline. So, you know, we were already warning our donors that we weren't sure we were going to be able to finish in time when we hadn't even started. And the third thing we did is we convened a community advisory committee. And this is a list of all of the all the representation. And some of those won't mean a lot to you, but what you need to know about the list is that it included people that were on both sides of the public housing aisle. It didn't include the extremes against public housing, although some of those folks were invited, but they didn't want to be associated with the project, which they may be regretting now. And part of the reason that we wanted to do this was because we wanted to start building our community coalition from the ground up. We wanted these people to be on board with us through the entire decision-making process so that they would feel ownership of the process, because we were going to need them to be our champions at the end regardless of what we came up with. And frankly, we needed the political protection. Having the president of the Chamber of Commerce on your steering committee is useful. It's useful. It is utilitarian useful. Having chairs of city boards in a context where the city council is against you is useful. And the city council doesn't even know why they're against you, but they know they're against you because you're talking about public housing and you shouldn't be, and you're doing research on it. All right? Okay. Now, this is the nice, neat slide that I would like to have been able to present you with and said, so this is what we did. Isn't that great? Except that that's not what was in store for us. We did provide the Community Steering Committee with training. We kept them in the process throughout the entire experience. But in terms of what was actually happening on a weekly basis, these are just a few of the highlights. I did not put everything down for you. But let's spend a little bit of time looking at this. Before we do, I do want to show you, though, that there was actually some work going on, right? We had these indicators that we were looking at and that we agreed on with the Community Steering Committee. These were a list of desktop indicators that would be considered in the analysis, and they would be supplemented by block level inspection indicators, all of which had a bearing on the impact of a neighborhood environment or housing unit on health. Okay? Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about how you selected those indicators?
You bet.
Are there places where there was an evidence base?
Yeah. So we did a couple of things. We did a really extensive literature review, and we gave the copies, which, I mean, it was probably a 60-page literature review, to the Community Steering Committee, which they, of course, didn't read. And so we had a meeting where we went through and we talked about each of the indicators, and we gave them our idea about whether or not it was going to be useful in terms of the relationship to health, useful in terms of can we get the data, useful in terms of is this a persuasive argument for what we're trying to accomplish, right? So there were a few different aspects of it. The desktop indicators we could generate from public information, publicly accessible information. The block level inspection indicators were additional things that were found in the literature review that we felt like were relevant to the local context. We lost a huge number of trees in the hurricane, for instance. We had to have tree canopy in there. There's no public information base for tree canopy that's useful at the block level. So that was something that we said, you know, this would be useful. Let's see if we can figure out a way to capture this data somewhere along in the process, recognizing that we weren't going to walk every block in Galveston to get that information. Is that enough? Okay. I will tell you, there were moments of levity, such as when one of the people on our community steering committee suggested that we include dog poop as one of our health indicators. We put it on the list, and we could not find a link to health in the literature. Also pointed out that it was kind of a fluid thing, and it might be difficult to, from an intervention point, although, signs are used, kind of didn't really take root with the group. But it was really interesting to engage folks, and I'll give you one example that was a really rewarding moment for me, was the issue of concentration of businesses permitted to sell alcohol for off-site consumption. The president of the Chamber of Commerce, and he was also president of the big local bank, came up to me after that meeting and said, "Can you talk to me more about this link? Because I would never in my life have thought that that would be linked to health." And so I took him through the whole evidence base in the literature review, and we talked about it, and he was just the whole time, he couldn't quite get over it. And by the end of the meetings, a year and a half later, this guy was actively engaging the language, actively saying, well, actually what we need to do is we need to be working on an ordinance about this. And it's not going to work if we do it this way, we've got to do it this way. And it was like, I have done my job. I have done my job. Okay. So I would like to say that was what I was here to tell you today, but the reality is it was much more complicated. So we developed this proposal in August of 2011. We had all this support, right? The grant was awarded in January of 2012. In February, the local elections began getting going. The political challengers were all campaigning on a platform of anti-public housing. I went in front of the city council one day and read a statement off of the state's Department of Housing website about what low-income housing tax credits were, because there was a lot of nonsense being spewed from city council members about what they were and how many there were in Galveston. I read it off the state website and cited the numbers of how many LIHTCs we had in Galveston, just as a little bit of a fact check. And this anti-public housing group in Galveston slapped me with a conflict of interest charge, which was really effective because I had to stop my work. And the conflict of interest, they were saying that because we had done some work for the Housing Authority at one point, then therefore it was inappropriate for us to say anything about public housing publicly, which, right. So then the president of my university had to take the conflict of interest charge, have it investigated, and then take the recommendation to the State Board of Regents, right? So very effective political maneuver. And be honest, kind of freaked me out a little bit because I hadn't been in that situation before. I'm old hat at it now, but at the time it was a little freaky. In March, we established the Community Steering Committee and began to train them. In May, in fact, the elections did have this massive political turnover, including the entire Housing Authority Board flipped and became the Galveston Anti-Housing Authority. So interesting to have a Housing Authority Board that consists of people who don't believe in public housing. So we were trying to figure out how we were going to deal with this. During September to November, we had an ongoing discussion with the Community Steering Committee about whether we should take all of those indicators and create an index and come up with a map that showed where the best places to build public housing in Galveston were. And every time that, no, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't. The real estate agents are going to be pissed. The Chamber of Commerce is going to be mad. everybody was going to be mad. There wasn't any constituent we could come up with. There wasn't any group that we could come up with that was going to be happy with a map that showed where the good neighborhoods were and where the bad neighborhoods were. So we really had to figure out a different way to do this. And we did. We figured out, you know, we're not going to have an aggregated map. What we're going to do is we're going to show what the results on each of the indicators were. And the more we thought about that, the more we realized that that was actually a solution for us in a lot of ways. Because what it did was it took the emphasis off of where to build the public housing, and it put the emphasis on indicators of healthy neighborhoods. It depoliticized the issue. And from that, we developed the idea that we're missing an opportunity here to have another important conversation, which is about how do we bring up all of the neighborhoods in Galveston. This stuff is relevant. There is not a neighborhood in Galveston that scores off the charts for all of these indicators. There is something every neighborhood could be working on. And we have this incredibly active network of neighborhood associations that want in on every decision, believe me. And this was a way to take something that was highly politicized and dividing the community and turn it into something that could be a community resource that everybody could use in different ways. So we developed a second question, which was, how do we understand the neighborhood health needs in Galveston? How do we create and support neighborhood health in Galveston? And it really became this second question. I mean, it was almost like we did two HIAs because the methodology was slightly different. We had to tweak the methodology. But what it did was really enrich the conversation and take it in a kind of a different direction. Okay? So this thing that was bothering us and causing political problems, once we were able to step back and take a new look at it, even though it wasn't what we intended and it wasn't what we thought we wanted, it actually created an opportunity for something that was much better. Okay, October, the decision maker shifts on who's going to develop the scattered sites from the Galveston Anti-Housing Authority to the Texas General Land Office. And so all of a sudden, that's great for us because we had started with GHA giving us our mandate to do this work. Then we lost it. And now someone else is the decision maker. So we quick hightailed it over to the GLO, told them what we were doing, and asked them if they were interested. They said yes. We said, oh, great, could you write a letter? Because I don't want another conflict of interest charge, and I don't want someone saying that we're meddling. If you're asking us to do it, then there's a legitimate reason for us to be doing this research. They said, yeah, you bet we can do that. So we were happy campers again. We also were trying to figure out how to frame the work so that we were very clear that we were distancing this work from a fair housing assessment. We didn't want this work to be confused with the fair housing assessment. Do you guys know what fair housing assessments are? It's basically, it's an analysis that's done when public housing or subsidized housing is built to determine whether it meets the criteria for affirmatively furthering fair housing, which includes not building in concentrated areas of concentrated poverty or areas of concentrated segregation, right? And the reason that we didn't want this work to be wrapped up into a fair housing assessment, which is what was beginning, the talk that was beginning to go around was that we were doing a fair housing assessment. Nope, this is not a fair housing assessment, was a couple of things. And I was telling Dr. Coombs about this earlier today. One was we knew that this was going to go to the courts and that the courts were going to make a decision and it was way above our pay grade and anything that we said about fair housing wasn't going to make a lot of difference. This was a big political fight that we weren't going to be in on. The only thing it could do is hurt us. The second reason we wanted to distance ourselves from the fair housing assessment was because we felt like we could actually make more of a local engagement difference if people understood this to be a tool and not a judgment. Okay? If we could get people to buy into the idea that the process made sense, then we didn't have to have the fight about what the results showed. At least not until we got to that point, at which point we've already got people who have been engaged in the process, right? Okay, so by March we had expanded our key questions and we had revised our analysis. Then something interesting happened last September when I was actually attending the National Health Impact Assessment meeting, which was one of the city council members called our donor and asked them for the results of our study. This was the most vocal anti-public housing guy on the city council. And what was really interesting about the way that he asked is that they said, no, I'm sorry, we can't do that. We don't do that, and it's not ready anyway. And he said, well, can you just tell me if it's good or bad? And I thought that was a very telling kind of way to phrase a question. Not what were the results or what does this tell us, but is it good or is it bad? As if there is a right and a wrong answer and not just information to consider. On the other hand, at the same time, I was at a meeting and the mayor was really nice to me one day. So, small victories, right? This was also part of the reason was that, and I guess I should have prefaced it by saying the mayor had been pretty vicious to me, including at public social events where I had to leave with my children. Yeah, it was, public health's fun. So this was also after the city had basically gone through an entire argument with the feds and the state about whether they were going to rebuild public housing. HUD had said, okay, number one, if you don't, you're going to lose $500 million in your other infrastructure recovery money. And number two, we will never help you recover from another hurricane again. And so they went, ooh. Not sure we can continue. So they had the city manager do a little analysis. Well, what would that do to the water bills if we did that? And, it went up like 50-fold or something like that. And it was like that was one area of the city's infrastructure. So they began to backpedal. They began to realize that this was not realistic. And so maybe the mayor felt like he had been a little aggressive with me. I don't know. So October was writing and rewriting according to recommendations of the Community Steering Committee. You have to say it this way and not this way. You have to use this language and not this language. Take that part out. That's not going to do you any good. And by the way, you need to have mentioned this in the recommendations. And so we were like, okay, good. We've got an engaged Community Steering Committee. By November, we were beginning to operationalize the dissemination plan, which meant scheduling meetings with local community groups to tell them about the healthy neighborhoods aspect of the work prior to the development of the scattered sites, so that by the time the scattered sites began to be being discussed, they were already familiar with this tool and the ways that it was being used. In December, a lawsuit was filed to put an injunction on the recovery of the public housing. That hearing is next week. And the chair of the Housing Authority Board suddenly called me up and said, so you want to tell me about this study you've been doing, because I'm concerned that it may not help us in this lawsuit. Because he didn't know what it was about, because he would never take my calls before that. And all of a sudden, he found himself on the other side of the line, because what they had to lose was the economic future of the city all of a sudden, right? Now the reality is our study doesn't say anything about fair housing, right? Because back there we had said we don't want to do fair housing. We had intentionally cut out any mention of fair housing in the report. All of our data was publicly available. Where's the smoking gun, right? I think by this point the the reputation of the study had begun to take on a life of its own. In January, we initiated community dissemination of information. The Community Steering Committee decided that they wanted to keep going with this work even after the health impact assessment was done. They wanted this to be a living project, to be used in conjunction with the development of healthy neighborhoods in Galveston, and they wanted other groups to begin to work with us on it also. They wanted the maps to be on the website. Many of the maps are already on the website. And they wanted to be able to use it in conjunction with ongoing community planning processes. All came from the steering committee, not us. Okay, good. February, we now have another election cycle every 2 years, right? Local elections. The scattered site contract was awarded. March 26th, the lawsuit will have its hearing. And on April 3rd, we will be meeting with new partners because just as the local government elections happen, there are also transitions on a lot of those community organizations that are participating with us. And so we have new people that are cycling in and out, which is a little bit tricky. It's a little bit tricky because those new people don't have the history and the institutional knowledge of everything that has passed and why decisions were made the way they were and the relationships with the other folks on the steering committee and everything. So we're trying to still figure out how to negotiate some of that. Okay, so a couple of things to just point towards as we kind of begin to look at what was the impact of this and how did those dynamics play out. So when it came to framing the issues in our larger report, we kind of had these very discrete 2 questions, you know, that were posed in a very researchery way, right? One was about location of scattered sites. The other is about interventions related to neighborhood level built environments to improve the city of Galveston residents, right? But that wasn't really what we were coming up with. And by the time we got to the process of writing the executive summary, you see a very different kind of language emerging. HIA offers a methodology, a methodology, not an answer, methodology for identifying census blocks based on various health indicators that would most support the health of scattered site residents. It also includes a methodology, a process for site selection, considerations, not answers, but considerations for placing families and supporting their health, and interventions that would increase the number of census blocks with relatively higher scores in terms of positive health. That was the first question, right? That's the kind of answers and responses that we were beginning to come up with for the first question, scattered sites. The second question was about neighborhood improvements. So HIA identifies priority neighborhood interventions, not better neighborhoods, worse neighborhoods, priority neighborhood interventions to address key community health needs for residents in general and could be used by lots of different kinds of groups, right? Talking about livability, desirability. This is the kind of language that the city Chamber of Commerce uses. It's the kind of language that the city uses when it wants to recruit families to come to the island. Okay? The executive summary itself still had all of the pieces of the work in it, but the language had shifted quite a bit from the original report. And of course we had to go back and rewrite the original report, obviously. Okay? Okay, so this was the proposed process for site selection for scattered sites related to health impact. So this was one of the pieces of the recommendation. And it's based on what we could facilitate in terms of a research team in informing the decision-making process. So you identify a potential site. See, at first what we thought is, oh, well, we'll just rank the whole island. And that wasn't going to work. And it wasn't going to work. Some prior work we had done for the Housing Authority was that they gave us an address and we ran an analysis on it and told them what the strengths and weaknesses of that address were and whether we thought that they should build there or not. That wasn't going to work for this process because we couldn't anticipate how far out the GLO was going to make decisions. So we wanted to have a process in place so that whenever they decide, we're ready to go, right? Okay, so I identify a potential site that meets the programmatic needs. Does it score in the top 20% of census blocks? Now, what we wanted to do there was say, if we used that index of indicators, right, that combined index, if a house did relatively well compared to other sites in the city, not compared to a national benchmark or anything else. We're not talking about whether or not to build scattered sites. We're talking about where's the best place in the city to do it. If it did really well, then it's probably okay. But we need to conduct a site visit, see if it's acceptable. Does the house meet other programmatic goals, meaning is it affordable and meets whatever other criteria they have, and then consider it for development, and then do you need another site? But if it's not scoring in the top 20%, let's look at mitigation strategies. Are there ways that we can improve the score? If not, we might pass. But we might consider lowering the threshold. We're not going to make that decision. We want GLO to take responsibility for making that decision through a public process. So there were these kind of loops built into the decision-making process that included assessment, but also mitigation, and then reanalysis once housing sites were identified to come online. Okay? I'll give you guys a second to take that one in and ask me any questions. Yeah?
One of the things that occurred to me is just the scale of time. I mean, looking at your timeline, it's already been 2 years. And aside from the political turnover, kind of what prompted you into this was a natural disaster.
Mm.
What would you all do if a second hurricane came along?
If it was very soon, I'm not sure Galveston could recover from a second hurricane. The political will that it took to keep the island alive after this hurricane, I mean, it was a big one. I mean, we have hurricanes all the time. Hurricane schmurricane, but this was a big one. It just hit too much of the island, too hard, all at once. If we had another one like that, I don't think they'd rebuild UTMB, and if they didn't rebuild UTMB, then the island would pretty much just turn into a little tourist destination that would be totally different from what it is now. Right after the hurricane, our center had an NIH grant that was focused on looking at disaster recovery, not the short-term recovery, but the longer-term recovery, and how could you build in recovery processes that would actually be protective of the next hurricane. The challenge with that work was that there was so much chaos in decision-making processes that it was very difficult to insert the kinds of recommendations that we were coming up with into planning processes. To know even all the plans that were going on at any particular moment and when you need to speak up was difficult. But we had this kind of collection of recommendations, everything from getting child care centers to have reciprocal agreements with regional child care centers so that they could exchange kids and teachers easily so that people had a place to send their kid so that they could get back on the island, to the housing issues and how to house displaced families so that they had proximity to the city to get back into their jobs, to jobs programs and how they could best support. We had a whole list of recommendations, but it's so chaotic after this kind of disaster. And that's part of the problem, is that when these things happen, it's like every time it happens, it's the first time. It's like, you guys you do this every year. You have natural disasters all across the country every year. A little more structure would be really helpful so that there is a process for intentionally incorporating protective mechanisms into the planning process. I think it's getting a little bit better. I mean, that was, Ike was 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago. I think it's getting a little bit better, not significantly better. I mean, if you've been following the news about Sandy and kind of the recovery that they're still doing and the nonsense that's going on with a lot of that, it's difficult. It's difficult. It's something that I think we just kind of have to keep working on.
Do you think that, that working with the GLO as opposed to your local organization might help with the longevity of some of the work that you're doing?
No, I don't. I would like to say yes, but they're not institutionalizing our work. What they're doing is they gave us a mandate, and our assignment is to work with whoever they contract with to build the scattered site housing in this, not with them directly.
Thank you.
So in terms of results, we're not doing maps, right? No maps, promise no maps. No central map, no ultimate aggregated map. But what we did want to do is we wanted to show some of the priority interventions. So again, it's not about where, it's about the what. It's about the health issue. How big a deal is this health issue for the community, right? So basically what this table shows is if we intervened to reduce the number of houses that were in close proximity to truck routes and high traffic areas, then that would affect 192 census blocks to move into that top 20% category. Okay? So it would affect a lot more than 192 census blocks, but it would affect 192 that would kind of automatically be in a good place. Now, proximity to truck routes and high traffic, you're not going to be able to completely mitigate that because we have an industrial base in the city. But there are routes through the city that make a lot more sense than everything that's being used right now. And all it would take is a city ordinance with some enforcement by local law enforcement and maybe some built environment changes to accomplish that. And that could make a big difference. Now, why do you think proximity to grocery stores scored so miserably when you saw how much of the island is not close to a grocery store? Anybody have any theories about that one? We're ready for this question when the community asks it, because we know they're going to ask it. It should score high, right? It's a big deal. Because the blocks that have less access to a grocery store, so many of them have so many other problems that one intervention of getting them close to a grocery store isn't going to push them into the top 20%. It'll get them up a little bit, but it's not going to make enough of a difference. Because the grocery stores are located in more privileged areas that have a lot of other advantages. A collection of advantages, not a collection of disadvantages. Okay? All right, so the other critical question was neighborhood priorities, right? So this table shows the impact of improving various indicators in terms of the general neighborhood development and health. So actually proximity to a recreation center would affect about 30,000 people. If everybody had proximity to now, how many recreation centers do we have to build to do that? And what's the cost? And what's the opportunity cost? Too. So those are the other kinds of considerations that have to be taken into account in the actual planning process. But this information is still useful, right? There are other issues like density of alcohol outlets that are a lot less expensive to intervene on. You put a moratorium. You put a limit on the density of alcohol outlets to be developed. You begin phasing them out. You grandfather who's in there now, but if a store closes and that area is already above the density threshold, you don't issue another license. That's cheap. That's a cheap intervention, right? The president of the Chamber of Commerce really wanted that one. We're going to let him run with that. So you begin to see some different kinds of things, and all of a sudden you do see proximity to a grocery store a lot higher, right? 25,000 people. So it's a little bit of a different priority list when you look at the two questions, right? I'm almost done. So the recommendations ended up being kind of a little more touchy-feely, plenty of science in there, but a lot of the application of the analysis comes in the actual engaged planning process when we begin working with neighborhood community organizations, when we begin working with the scattered site developers, when we begin working with the Chamber of Commerce to develop messaging. And lo and behold, the Chamber of Commerce has developed an entire initiative about bringing families together, families to Galveston by improving neighborhoods. How lucky. Where did that idea come from? So we're looking forward to partnering with them on that. Okay? So the effect on coalition building, right? That was in my title, right? We were able to bring together a pretty diverse group of people with different political interests. The president of the Galveston Island Neighborhood, Galveston Alliance of Island Neighborhoods, which is the collection of neighborhood associations, was not for public housing. He's fine now. He's happy with all of this work. He wants it pulled out. He's helping us arrange a talk to his group in a couple of weeks. We're good to go. A lot of these people didn't have any health or public housing background. They learned a lot in the process, and they are much more vocal about these issues now when we see them at all kinds of various functions in the city. And we were able to demonstrate that we can solve problems at a big table in Galveston without harassing each other and attacking each other. And that was beginning to be a problem in our community. There's a deeper understanding of the HIA process, the evidence base, the potential for guiding local discussions and decisions. The CSC is, in fact, a lot of them are leading dissemination processes. We are planning to partner with a city board, the Families, Children, and Youth Board, which at this point we've already presented to them, and they're going to be using a lot of this data for their own planning work for the next couple of years. Also, 2 city council members have now seen our work and are interested in incorporating it into their community priority setting for their $200,000 infrastructure investment pot of money that they voted themselves to have. And working with the GLO for creating a development plan for the neighborhood heavily impacted by Ike, which is the North Side Redevelopment Plan. In addition to the scattered sites, that developer will also be developing a plan for the recovery of the North Side neighborhood. And this kind of information not only feeds into that part of our process, but it allows us to bring our partners, which is actually the more important part of the process, to the table to talk about what their interests are, because a lot of those folks are the North Side. Okay, so a divisive political issue has really become much more of a platform for local planning and change. The impact of the deeper engagement strategy on the research, because it works both ways, right? The research can impact the planning, the engagement strategy also impacts the research. So we were told public housing is too political, don't do it. I was threatened. I was told I probably needed to move off the island. I should get a flak jacket, etc. Okay, let's reframe the question. Take a breath. Everybody take a breath. Look at it. Listen to your wise advisors. See if there's a way that actually doing something in a different way than you envisioned could actually have a better outcome. But you also have to be careful about not selling out your neighborhood, your community constituents, right? This is a problem with HIAs at times, is that you can get so enthralled with the idea of creating consensus and presenting mitigation strategies that you end up with a situation where the community that you originally were working to try to protect goes, what happened? We're not getting what we want. This is not what we wanted. You're compromising. And it becomes, the mitigation recommendations become an apologia for doing the work anyway, the way that the original proposers wanted to do it. And that's an ethical issue that you have to negotiate in the moment. It's not something you can have a clear idea of ahead of time. I've never seen somebody give a persuasive approach to how you do that ahead of time, but it's something that you really need to be aware of at every step along the way, because it also becomes a frog cooking in a pot kind of issue where every incremental step of a group decision-making process eats away a little bit at the community interests. Okay? So that explicit interest on focusing on health impacts, not affirmatively furthering fair housing was really useful, in addition to the methodology used to using relative comparisons of locations within the city, as opposed to trying to say this is Galveston's a good place to build or Galveston's a bad place to build. If you're going to build it, we recommend you do it this way. No maps, disaggregated maps, but no master map, right? It was an orientation around the process. And then the trickle out of information along with political advice from the Community Steering Committee. And the careful timing has led to fewer attacks on the work, I'm happy to say. So again, this issue of sensitivity to co-opting, demonstration of ability to work together, there is a lot of power in an HIA that's related to the timing of the work, not just the initiation of the work, but what happens at different stages and how that fits into a whole process of decision making happening in the community, setting the agenda, the participatory nature of of stakeholders. And the punchline is, do you remember when I told you that the president of the Galveston Alliance of Island Neighborhoods is now transitioning off and there's a new group of people who are going to be coming on board? One of those people happens to be the city council member who called up our donor and demanded the results of the report. So now he will get his results of the report. And we will see what the next chapter brings. Thank you all very much. I'm happy to talk more and take questions.
We have a few minutes for discussion, questions. Folks have things, yeah.
I just had a question. Who are the actual parties to the lawsuit that you're going to pick up next week?
This is ironic. The name of the group that's bringing the lawsuit is ironic. It's the Galveston Open Government Project. Is suing the city council. Well, originally they were suing the city council, the GLO, and the Housing Authority Board. They've now dropped the charges. They've dropped the city council and the Housing Authority Board from the lawsuit, so it's only against the GLO. And because they don't really have any standing, because they are not public housing residents, they have found some public housing residents that were willing to put their name on this lawsuit who happen to live in Hitchcock. Now, the standing issue is a big deal, and it's their biggest weakness because the idea you have to have standing to bring a lawsuit, right? It means that you have to be able to make the argument that you personally stand to lose for what's about to be done. These are people that live in public housing in Hitchcock, which is a town about 30 miles away, 20 miles away, used to live in Galveston, and their argument is that building the lawsuit isn't about the scattered sites yet. Right now it's about the footprint sites, but it's all the same thing. But that building public housing in Galveston would harm them because it was being built in an area that has, the city has a lot of poverty and a lot of minorities. And the problem with that standing argument is nobody would force them to move there. They have a choice. Nobody is forced to move into the public housing. So the idea that you could argue standing in this kind of a case is problematic for them.
So I just had a follow-on comment, and then just coming from disaster epidemiology and thinking a little bit about the language that we use now from whether you're from FEMA or CDC is community resiliency.
Right.
And I think that you really can take this whole several-year process, and you don't even have to reframe it all that much, but use it as a powerful testimony to community resiliency and how much that actually will, contribute to perhaps maybe it's unseen, obviously, but when the next event happens, maybe these coalitions will come together more quickly. A hurricane's going to come again. Hopefully it's not as bad as it could be, but that these things keep pulling the community together and the relationships keep building up that resiliency, and that's actually a component. It's very hard to measure, but it seems to me that you should be able to point to that as something that may...
I would be concerned, how do we define resiliency? Did the city recover, or did the individual constituencies within the city recover? Because I think that the low-income population in Galveston right now is so disenfranchised, feels viscerally so excluded and unwanted from the process, and has been reduced in numbers and scattered across the state, that I think if we had another hurricane, I don't think that they would even try to come back.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I mean, that's true, but I think I'm just thinking more as you go forward with these community, cohesive sort of collaborative efforts, especially if you're, including the disenfranchised, that can only be positive.
We hope
I don't
so,
think there's ever a point that,
we hope so.
that
It's difficult. I mean, working in the land of Ron Paul is a challenge, but hopefully there have been some lessons here about stubbornness, and inevitability of some kinds of processes. But it'll be interesting to see, because you're right, another hurricane will come.
So in terms of some of the different health indicators that you're looking at,
Mhm.
obviously you had to take into consideration practical considerations in terms of sort of what data you have available.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just curious, if data wasn't such a sort of constraint, what other types of health indices you would be interested in measuring? if you had an opportunity?
Well, I mean, that was part of why we had these block level indicators, right? There were some things that we didn't have data on, but if somebody gave us a specific site, it's easy enough to go to the site, do an assessment on site for that block, and come back with some numbers. So the tree canopy was an important one. Sidewalk quality is a big one. Signs of physical disorder, traffic calming, resident pride and security, which is kind of this anti-blight kind of, cohesive mishmash that has some specific ways of measuring it. And then specific issues about the unit itself. There's also, this research had a big focus on the built environment. And, we tried to be explicit and say there's an awful lot of stuff about what makes a neighborhood healthy that's not captured in this, that's really about the social and economic environment. And that needs to be taken into consideration. And that's work that needs to be done in Galveston. It's beyond the scope of this piece of work, but, I think there's some sentence at the end of the executive summary that's something like, but we look forward to working with the community on these issues coming soon, whatever. But really trying to get in there, we need to be talking about a living wage. We need to be talking about access to health care services in a way that's not just about geographic access, it's about effective access. We need to be talking about adult education. We need to be talking about child development and affordable daycare and things like that. Not just the location of daycare centers, right?
So related to the issue of the social environment, is this issue whenever a community is displaced or at risk of getting displaced of how to look at social embeddedness, cultural history,
Mhm.
community history, generational
Right.
attachment to the land, all the stuff that is addressed in root shock and the follow-ups work. And so that's an important factor that I don't think we've done very well at grappling with that.
Yeah, I probably should have said something about that here, because we actually did a series of focus group discussions over a couple of months with, 25 residents of Galveston, low-income residents of Galveston, about their neighborhoods and whether they felt like they were healthy places to live, and what they, a little bit of an asset building approach. What do you feel like are the good things about this neighborhood? What do you feel like are the challenges? And it was really nice qualitative work. And the guy who did it put a lot of work into it, and we presented it to this community steering committee. And the reason we had done it was because there were some folks, some of the housing advocates on the community steering committee really wanted it. And it probably ate up 30% of our budget for the whole project. And we couldn't end up using it because by the time it was done, and the community steering committee read the report, they felt like it was going to undermine the strength of the report by putting too strong of a qualitative advocacy voice into the work. And so what we ended up doing was taking quotes from those focus groups and kind of boxing them next to specific indicators that they were related to show that there was a community reflection on the perception of this indicator. And the write-up of the focus group results itself is going to be put out separately. But it was kind of sad. But it was a political decision. It was a decision about strengthening the political positioning of the report when it's out, to say, that's great, but you know what? You're going to do yourself more harm than good by putting this out like this. And it's great stuff. I mean, it's a lot about how the neighborhoods have changed over generations. It's a lot about the disenfranchisement of the youth locally. It's really good stuff, but we have a lot of ideas of how we can use it as soon as we get this piece out the door.
Okay, well, join
Thanks
me,
so much.
please, and thank you. Presenting us, I'm amazed at, I mean, we always talk about the politics of doing research, but just amazed at the level of political engagement, the level of political sophistication with which you guys navigated some pretty tricky waters. And I think some great examples of the ways that your community steering committee was really instrumental in trying to figure out how to navigate that space. So great example. So thanks very much. Those of you who are still remaining with us, if you wouldn't mind filling out the short evaluation form and leaving it with us. And hope to see you guys on April 2nd when Nick's here to present his work on corporate reduction of disease.
You definitely don't want to miss that one.
He
It's
is
really
amazing.
good.
Yeah. Thanks.
Good. Good. It was fun. I love talking about this stuff.